Imagine walking into a place where the air stings your nose like a slap, thick with the smell of burnt meat, stale beer, and something you can't quite place, maybe despair. Imagine a roof barely holding back the sky, and a floor that squelches under your feet not from rain, but from something far worse. Now imagine this is your best option for survival tonight. Welcome to the raw, unforgiving world of medieval roadside shelters places, less like cozy taverns and more like the waiting rooms of fate itself. This isn't a fantasy dreamland filled with cheerful songs and hearth-lit camaraderie. This is the bone-crunching, mud-splattered truth of life in 13th century northern Gaelwyn, where surviving another day meant you were already one of the lucky few. And tonight, we're not just going to tell you what it looked like, we're going to drag you through the door, sit you down next to the one-eyed butcher from Eastdrake, and show you the dripping ceiling above your head. Buckle in. In our comfortable era of GPS-guided vacations, hotel buffets, and rest stops with flush toilets, it's nearly impossible to understand the brutality of travel in medieval Gaelwyn. Roads were often no more than glorified trenches grooved by countless cartwheels and shaped by every downpour into thick, impassable sludge. If it rained, the path disappeared into a sucking mire that could trap a wagon or snap a man's ankle. A mere 20 miles could become an epic ordeal of days-weeks if you had the misfortune of bad weather and worse company. But the mud wasn't your worst enemy. Outlaws known as shadebacks haunted the dense groves and gorges, emerging at dusk like hungry wolves to strip travelers of every coin, limb, or breath they had left. Weather offered no kindness either. Bone-chilling nights would follow suffocating heat, and both could crush your spirit before your journey even began. Sickness was an invisible stalker, waiting at every stagnant puddle or communal mug. Hygiene? A whispered rumor. Medical help? A prayer's gamble. In that world, the inn wasn't a luxury. It was your only shot at making it through the night. It was the fragile thread between the living and the lost. For a travelling spice seller like Emeric of Thornhollow leading his stubborn mule across bandit-prone hill trails, the inn represented more than rest. It was a lockbox for his precious saffron and cinnamon, and maybe, if he was lucky, a dry blanket and a corner by the fire. For Elra the Spearmaid, fresh off a campaign defending the southern frontier, it was where she could buy back a bit of humanity through a bowl of stew and a cheap joke shouted across the ale-soaked table. Pilgrims like old Brother Khan, barefoot and blistered, trudged towards sacred shrines but still needed warm porridge and a place to tend their wounds. And even for common folk like Greta, taking her cheese wheels to market, the glow of an inn meant safety from wolves four-legged and otherwise. These outposts of civilization were vital. Without them, many regions would have remained ghost lands, impassable, isolated, and empty. The local barons and landkeepers, though more interested in taxes than mercy, often grudgingly maintained road networks for trade, war, or royal decree. But without the inns known as holdhouses among the wealthier or go-brooms for the working poor, none of it worked. A day's travel was measured not in miles but in how far your legs, your horse, or your luck could carry you before darkness swallowed the land. And when night fell, if you weren't behind thick doors, you were a shadow waiting to be erased. So picture this. After a soul-pounding trek, our filthy, exhausted traveller, let's call him Tobanese, squinting through the twilight mist. Up ahead, barely outlined against the dying sky, he sees the crooked silhouette of a building. It's squat, ugly, and smells like wet goats before he even gets within 10 yards. But it's shelter. Forget the idealized medieval inn you see in fairy tales, the kind with cheerful wenches, golden chandeliers, and hearty laughter rolling out the windows. What Tobin sees is a structure half sunk into the mud, made of whatever the locals could cobble together. In the forested north, its timber often blackened from years of smoke and mildew. On stony coasts, they use jagged rock and daubed gaps with a mix of clay, hay, and animal waste. Yes, you read that right. Dung. Because that's what they had. Windows? If they existed, they were more like arrow slit stew, narrow for light, too wide to keep out the cold. Glass was a treasure for castles, not gutter inns. Openings were stuffed with oiled linen or ragged skins. Some were sealed with wooden planks that creaked when the wind pushed through. Chimneys. If the place had one, it probably leaned like a drunk. Otherwise, the smoke just funneled through a hole in the thatched roof, escaping reluctantly into the sky. As for a sign, don't expect anything fancy. Literacy was rare, so a clump of ivy, a hanging goat skull, or a painted barrel on a plank would signal what sort of services you might find inside. If you saw a foxtail nailed to the lintel, it meant cheap ale. If you saw a red handprint, best move on. Surrounding the hold house was usually a dump disguised as a courtyard. Food scraps, human waste, and animal droppings mingled into a fragrant stew right underfoot. Pigs rummaged through bones and broken jugs, while skeletal dogs snarled over moldy crusts. No one cleaned up. No one cared. Inside, that's when the senses truly got assaulted. Step over the warped threshold, and you get hit with a wall of smells: wood smoke, sweat, old meat, wet wool, and something you later realized was vomit in the corner. Your eyes would tear up from the smoke hanging like a funeral shroud just below the ceiling, trapped beneath heavy beams blackened from years of open fires. If you were lucky, there was a hearth in the center of the room, its embers choked with ashes and the occasional chicken bone. Most hold houses didn't bother with real chimneys. Smoke clawed its way out through slits in the roof or simply lingered, turning every guest into a walking ham roast. The hearth served as a stove, heater, and gathering spot, but comfort, that caustic straw, required very low expectations. The crowd was a cocktail of humanity: weather-bitten merchants, grizzled mercenaries, giggling farmhands, silent monks, and the occasional runaway hiding behind a new name. Voices rose in drunken joy or erupted in sudden, knife-sharp rage. Swearing was more common than greetings. Songs got louder as mugs emptied. And no one sat with their back to the room unless they were fools or too drunk to care. If you think this is a rough welcome, you haven't even met the beds yet. But we'll get to those. Let's just say this. In the medieval world, staying in an inn was rarely a comfort. It was a calculated risk. A gamble you took because sleeping outside meant freezing, being robbed, or waking up with a wolf chewing your leg. The walls gave you a false sense of safety. But inside, there were other dangers: sickness, knives, betrayal, or simply the worst ale ever brewed. And yet, every traveler trudged toward these godless havens. Because in a world that wanted you dead by 30, the chance to just rest was a kind of salvation. So if you're ready to step deeper into this smoky chaos, to see what lay beyond the mug of spoiled cider and the hound asleep on your bed, then follow or subscribe the channel. What comes next isn't just history, it's a night you'll never forget. The moment you stepped inside one of these inns, if you dared, you'd be greeted by a haze so thick it might as well have had claws. Smoke slithered from the central hearth and coiled around the rafters like a sulking demon, seeping through every gap in the walls, floorboards, and splintering ceiling. There wasn't a single surface left untouched. Beams, tabletops, stool seats, one was coated with a greasy grey-black paste, the kind you could scrape off with a knife. That's if your stomach could handle the smell long enough. Light? You wish. A medieval hold house didn't glow, it brooded. Fat-dripping tallow candles sputtered like dying insects, casting uneven shadows and letting off a reek so foul it could make your eyes sting and your appetite vanish. If they couldn't afford candles, the fallback was even worse. Fire splinters, thin slivers of bone, dry pine wedged into cracks in the wall or clenched in hand. They flamed, hissed, and died within minutes, creating more smoke than light and ensuring at least one daily fire scare. This dim realm was painted in shades of soot and misery. The room was barely wide enough to hold 36 souls, but somehow it always held more. Misshapen tables carved with vulgar sketches and old names stood unevenly on warped legs, flanked by benches that looked like they'd collapse if you breathed too hard. Every surface was sticky-coated in a stew of dried ale, animal grease, and spilled stew. The floor? If you could see it, it was either packed earth as hard as an anvil or poorly nailed boards that creaked louder than the patrons. More often, it was hidden beneath layers of musty straw, rotting rushes, or leaf litter. In theory, that bedding helped absorb the daily deluge of spit, slop, and spilled drink. In practice, it became a breeding ground for creatures that made even rats look polite. Fleas, lice, ticks, you'd be sharing your seat with a crawling circus. The smell was indescribable. A vicious blend of stale beer, burning lard, sweat-soaked tunics, damp fur, and something fermented lurking in the corners. If your senses weren't already numbed by the journey, they'd be bludgeoned into submission the moment you entered. And if you thought the crowd might be your saving grace, think again. The common room was a chaotic stew of humanity. Wild-eyed mercenaries traded war stories over cracked mugs, toothless gamblers argued over card games made from wood slats, and sleepy peasants curled into corners trying to ignore the drunk who'd passed out in the fireplace ash. Chickens strutted across the floor with the confidence of owners. Once, someone even claimed a pig was snoring behind the bar. No one checked. Conversations ranged from slurred laughter to loud threats. Voices clashed, brawls sparked, and somewhere in the background, a fiddle screeched out a mournful tune that only grew sadder the more you listened. Everyone was on edge. Everyone was armed. Behind the hearth, nestled in a corner that barely deserved the name kitchen, pots of indeterminate origin simmered on iron hooks. If you were lucky, you'd get a scoop from the top of the cauldron. If you weren't, your spoon might unearth something you'd rather not name. Bowls were shared, spoons were licked, and no one questioned where the meat came from. Drinks? There was one default offering ale, but forget the golden sparkle and smooth pour you see in modern taverns. No bubbles, no cool glass. Just a cloudy, tepid sludge known affectionately in Gallowmere as swamp brew. Made from malted grain, rainwater, and whatever wild yeast floated in the air, this version of ale was murky, filling, and potent. And that was the good batch. You could get anything from fermented porridge to sour vinegar, depending on how the brewer, often the innkeeper's no-nonsense spouse, was feeling that month. Some added tree bark for flavour, others snuck in a handful of ground herbs to give it bite. It wasn't rare to drink something that caused more bowel movements than pleasure, yet people drank it religiously because it was safer than water. That's right, water, that basic human necessity, was a killer back then. Wells were often near cesspools, rivers became sewage drains, rain barrels, breeding vats. So even toddlers were given low beer, a kind of weak ale, barely alcoholic, but fermented enough to cleanse itself of parasites. In fact, the phrase better drunk than dead may as well have been born in a medieval pub. Wine was available, but only if your purse jangled with coin. Imported from across the sea, usually from the southern duchies or eastern trade town, swine was a luxury. And like all luxuries in this world, it was regularly faked. Tavern keepers would water it down, tint it with crushed berries, or mix it with leftover grape pulp. If you were fooled, that was your fault. And if you complained, you might find yourself sleeping outside with a black eye. In theory, there were officials known as malt watchers or draft tasters appointed by local lords to ensure fair trade. They were supposed to taste every barrel, check every measure, and ensure no trickery befell the customer. In reality, they were easily bribed, rarely showed up, and often went blind from drinking too many samples. So every sip you took in that common room was a gamble. Would it fill your belly? Would it give you a fever? Or would you wake up with a vision of St. Rowan and an urgent need for a bucket? No one knew. No one cared. It was all part of the charm. But the food? That's where things got even more dangerous. A menu in a medieval holdhouse was about as imaginative as a soggy stone. Breadants, dark and brick-like, formed the bulk of the meal. Usually made from barley, rye, or oats, and packed with bran, it was more chewable shield than delicacy. White bread existed, sure, but that was the stuff of nobles, bishops, or the occasional bard who got lucky with a lord's daughter. You wouldn't see it unless the innkeeper owed someone a life debt. Hot meals, when offered, came in one pot. That pot sat over the fire, perpetually boiling, absorbing whatever was tossed into it. Carrots, onions, rutabaga, leeks, dried beans, and wild herbs were common. Meat was rare and questionable. Stringy bits from old livestock, pig heads, bones, organs. Once, someone swore they bit into a rat. No one doubted them. If you were lucky enough to be near the coast or a river, fish would appear usually salted into leather or smoked into jerky, but again, freshness was relative. Sometimes you'd find a cod so far gone it could walk back into the sea by itself. Still, beggars couldn't be choosers. All of this was ladled into cracked bowls, eaten with wooden spoons, and washed down with the infamous swamp brew. Spices? You might get some salt if the barkeep was in a good mood. Otherwise, flavour was whatever nature delivered. And yet, people came back, night after night, year after year. Because in a world ruled by cold steel, brutal weather, and worse men, a smoky room, a hot bowl, and a questionable drink were better than nothing, better than wolves, better than freezing to death, better than facing another lonely night on the road. In these halls, no one asked your name. No one cared where you were from. But if you made it through the night, you were family at least until morning. So if you think the worst is behind you, think again. The real horror is where you sleep. And in part 3, we'll take you to the upstairs chambers where the straw turns to crawling nightmares and secrets crawl louder than footsteps. Until then, follow or subscribe the channel and don't drink the ale unless you're ready to roll the dice on your stomach lining. If the mystery stew and smoke-drenched ceiling didn't break your spirit, what came next surely tried. After choking down a ladle of half-rotted broth and washing it down with whatever poison passed for ale, most travellers longed for just one thing, a bit of sleep. But sleep in a medieval roadhouse was less a comfort and more a test of your will to live. Forget soft pillows or rooms with a lock. In the gritty hill towns of old Darrowmere, inns weren't built for rest, they were built for survival, barely. Especially for the common folk, lodgings were communal, chaotic, and cold enough to rattle your bones. The grandly named Great Hall was, in reality, one oversized barn-like space where the term bed was a cruel joke. Instead, travellers were offered bundles of hay thrown on the hard-packed dirt floor, or, if the place was feeling fancy, on creaky wooden planks. These makeshift mattresses were stuffed with straw, leaves, or hay, so old it could pass for mulch. And don't get the wrong idea, this stuff wasn't changed regularly. In fact, some piles hadn't seen fresh straw since the last plague year. You didn't sleep so much as itch, twitch, and try to ignore the crawling sensation that never, ever stopped. Because it wasn't your imagination. These beds were infested battleground-stony hellscapes teeming with fleas, lice, mites, and the kind of bedbugs that could draw blood faster than a highway bandit. And if the bugs didn't get you, the stench would. Sheets? If they existed, they were thick, yellow-stained rags passed around like gossip, heavy with the sweat and stories of guests long gone. Blankets were rougher than bark and carried the sharp, sour scent of too many unwashed nights. You didn't tuck yourself in you, braced yourself against them. Most of the time, you weren't sleeping alone either. Space was a luxury, and warmth was currency, so strangersmen, women, children huddled together, a writhing bundle of cloaks, limbs, and snores. Privacy? Non-existent. Hygiene? A cruel myth. If there was a water basin, it sat in some dim corner of the inn, its contents cloudy and cold, reused so many times that you'd hesitate to rinse a spoon in it. Soap? That was for dukes and bishops. If you were lucky, you'd get a splash of muddy water in the face and call it a bath. If you weren't, you'd just wipe your face with your sleeve and lie to yourself. Then came winter. Doors didn't close properly. Windows didn't exist. Wind screamed through every crack in the wall, icing your bones and turning your breath to steam. The only warmth came from the person beside you who may or may not have been a pickpocket, a plague carrier, or both, and there was no fire in the sleeping rooms. That luxury was reserved for the ale-soaked main hall. You fell asleep shivering and woke up coughing, assuming you got any sleep at all. It was the perfect breeding ground for illness. The common cold was just the beginning. Fevers, rashes, and worse lurked in the shadows. Typhoid, rot, pox, or the slow creeping death of dysentery. During outbreaks, inns like these became funeral parlors without walls. Leprosy, plague, and not the biblical kind, this was real, silent, and swift. But still, they came. Travelers of all kinds, drawn to these hubs of warmth and danger, of news and nonsense. Because inns weren't just shelters, they were social crossroads. Under those cracked roofs and above those infected floors, you'd find an entire kingdom of personalities. Like Roderick, the road-weary cloth merchant, always keeping one hand on his purse and the other on his belt knife. He'd been robbed before, he wouldn't let it happen again. His packs were filled with fine velvet and dyed linen, but his eyes were dark from too many nights watching doorways instead of sleeping. Then there was Marna, a caravan cook with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could shatter mugs. She passed through town once a season and always left a trail of broken hearts and unpaid tabs. She didn't need a bodyguard, she was one. You'd also find Darian the Sellsword, scar-faced and missing 2 fingers. He claimed to have fought in the East Wall skirmishes, but no one could confirm if he served a banner or just liked swinging steel. Either way, no one sat near him if they could help it. Then, of course, the holy travellers. Pilgrims like Brother Wenrick and Sister Ilia, worn sandals on their feet and prayer beads in hand. They'd walk all the way from the marshes to the cliffs to kiss some bone fragment of a saint hand. They needed shelter like everyone else, but even they weren't safe in a hold house like this. Because alongside these characters came the shadows. Vagrants, cutthroats, beggars, swindlers, and not the charming, clever ones. No, these were the desperate, dangerous sort, those with nothing to lose and everything to steal. They'd sit quietly in the corners, listening to every coin clink, watching who carried heavy packs, who drank too much, who fell asleep first. It was a powder keg of suspicion. One wrong glance, one stray word, and it all exploded. A dice game turned bloody, a bedmate accused of theft, a woman touched without consent. Fights erupted over spilled ale or whispered insults. Daggers flashed in the half-light, and mugs doubled as weapons. You never knew if a loud laugh was the start of a joke or a cover for a robbery. Robberies themselves were routine. Sometimes the victim never woke up. A bit of herb slipped into their drink, a hand in their satchel, and by morning they were lighter by a few coins are missing entirely. Some inns had dark corners where travelers vanished. Others had stables that doubled as makeshift graves. Security? If you were rich, you hired muscle. If you were poor, you stayed awake and hoped. And the innkeeper? That poor soul walked a tightrope. He wasn't just a barkeep. He was the judge, the bouncer, the spy. He knew every regular what they drank, who they owed, who they feared. He'd seen secrets passed in whispers and plans made over mugs. He listened always because knowledge was power, and in the world of inns, power was the difference between survival and ruin. Innkeepers like old Borin the Crookback had to think 2 steps ahead. He kept a cudgel under the bar and a dagger in his boot. If someone caused trouble, he dealt with it. If a body turned up, he had friends who could make it disappear. He knew how to read people who was lying, who was running, and who was too stupid to survive the night. Inns weren't just stops, they were nerve centers of rural life. Politics, prices, soldier movements, plague whispers, market scams, all of it passed through the inn before it ever reached the city scribe or town crier. Want to know if a tax collector was on his way? Ask the man slumped in the back. Want to hear if the Duke's army was moving east? Buy the fiddler a drink. He saw the patrols pass 2 nights ago. These inns were where rumors were born, where alliances were made, and where knives found throats in the dark, and still every road led to one. Because despite the filth, the fights, the parasites, and the poison ale, where else could you go? So if you think we've reached the darkest corner of this world, think again. In part 4, we'll dive even deeper into the secrets behind the innkeepers, the hidden rooms, the secret codes, and the untold tales whispered from bunk to bunk. Until then, sharpen your blade, watch your purse, and above all, follow or subscribe the channel. The worst night is yet to come. Behind every groaning door and flickering hearth, the medieval inn held more secrets than stories. And while it was a place of crude rest and shared misery, it was also a hotspot for whispers, quiet talks about border raids, troop movements, missing tax carts, or disappearances that no one wanted traced. News travelled faster than wagons, and it often began with a steaming mug and a nod toward the back table. But not all conversations were innocent. Inns like the Rusty Horn in Westmere or the Pig's Mercy outside Dunford weren't just homes for gossip, they were hatcheries for plots. Schemes were born between sips of bad wine. Rebellions sparked with slurred vows and sealed handshakes. Sometimes the innkeeper knew, sometimes they didn't, but all too often they ended up in the middle whether they wanted to be or not. Spies, soldiers, rogues, and royal informants treated the barkeep like a living scroll. Who came through here last night? Did anyone ask about Lord Felmar's convoy? Hear anything about rebel camps upriver? The innkeeper became a reluctant oracle, questioned by both the crown and the crooks, and if he said the wrong thing to the wrong side. He didn't say much else afterward. In peaceful times, inns were hazardous. In war, they were minefields. During the blood-soaked feud between the Redmark and Calthorn dynasties, every dusty path became a battleground. Every hold house, a pawn. If a band of rebels needed a roof, they took one. If the King's Guard needed a stable, they commandeered it. No negotiation, no mercy. Inns became barracks, stables, torture dens, or makeshift war rooms overnight. Soldiers spilled through the doors, muddy boots and broken blades, slamming their helmets down and demanding stew, drink, and silence. Rooms were repurposed into sick bays. Straw became bedding for the dying, bandages were made from torn shirts, and screams often replaced snores. Owners were caught in the worst possible position, squeezed between enemies with no winning move. If you refused to help a warband, your inn could be burned to the ground or worse. But if you did help, you were marked as a collaborator. When the wind shifted and the enemy took the town, you were the first on the list. You might be dragged out into the square and hanged from your own signpost. Looting was so common it might as well have been part of the marching orders. Soldiers rarely received pay. They took their wages in food, jewelry, livestock, and flesh. Inns, with their stores of salted meat, dry ale, and coin from travellers, were irresistible targets. Some innkeepers buried their valuables under floorboards. Others painted sacred marks on their doors, hoping the gods or the bandits would pass them by. Dark eras etched themselves into tavern walls. During the Blackfire Uprising, the Baron Pike Inn was stormed by rebel deserters who executed 3 royal tax agents at dawn. Their heads were left in the fire pit until the place burned down. That same year, the Hollow Tree Inn near the Wormcliff Woods was used by both sides for planning ambushes, storing arms, and eventually betrayal. The innkeeper's silence bought him one night's safety. He was gone by morning. In the grand theatre of war and politics, inns were rarely centre stage, but they were always backstage. Conspiracies were sketched out on stained parchment between meals. Temporary alliances were forged between old enemies with nothing but mead and desperation. A silent nod from a barkeep could save a rebel's life or seal it. It wasn't just the fighting that ravaged the inn trade. Nature itself seemed determined to crush any trace of comfort. The bitter cold of the so-called frostbite era, what we now call the Little Ice Age, descended like a slow death. Winters were longer, sharper, snow piled so high it sealed doorways shut. Wind screamed through bone-dry forests and into the paper-thin walls of every country inn. Firewood became gold, fuel prices soared, and still the frost came, creeping into every seam of every door, every toe of every sleeping guest. Inns turned into ice boxes, the stew pot froze, the ale turned slushy, people slept in their clothes if they had them. Innkeepers like old Harwin of Talomere were forced to chop their own furniture to keep the hearth burning. Entire buildings cracked from the cold. Then there was the famine. Too much rain, or not enough. Crops failed. Fields flooded. Mice ate more grain than men. Bread disappeared from the market stalls, replaced by bitter weeds and boiled nettles. Inns had nothing left to serve. Porridge became soup. Soup became broth. Broth became water. Hungry travelers traded jewelry for soup bones. Some stole from each other. Others just starved. Starvation pushed people to madness. Whole families left their villages in search of food and found only empty promises behind each inn door. And those who did make it inside found prices raised so high even the barkeep looked ashamed to say them. The lucky ones got a crust of bread and a nod toward the hay pile. The unlucky ones got turned away into the snow. But the most merciless enemy of them all wasn't frost or famine, it was disease. Contagion ran rampant. Smallpox disfigured the living. Typhus swept through entire valleys. Dysentery crawled into every open wound. And then came the grey lung plague. Inns became pest houses overnight, packed with coughing, vomiting, trembling bodies, rat-bitten, fever-slick, oozing and shivering. No one wanted to be there. But no one had anywhere else to go. When the bells tolled for plague, the inns emptied, or they filled with only the dying. Bodies were buried behind the stable in mass pits. The innkeeper, trembling and hollow-eyed, might be the one to hear a final confession, offer a last drink, or close a stranger's eyes for good. In places like the Briar Row Tavern, the death toll was so high the rooms were sealed for months. Rats made nests where guests once slept. And in the middle of this storm, the innkeeper, he wasn't some cheerful host with rosy cheeks and a clean apron. He was a survivor, a negotiator, a gambler with no cards left, a man-or-woman who ran a halfway house between life and death. Innkeepers like old Cyric, the one-eyed brute of Black Hollow, weren't sentimental. They ran their inns with a fist and a club. They sniffed out trouble the way wolves smell blood. They could spot a liar in a heartbeat and a thief by the way he lifted his spoon. Suppliers cheated them, guards taxed them, drunks threatened them. And yet, they opened their doors every dusk, as if daring the world to bring something worse. It wasn't just the men. Many inns were run by their wives-grit tough women like Berla of Westridge, who brewed the ale, served the slop, cleaned the mess, and broke up fights with a ladle and a look. Some became legends, even feared. Others disappeared without a trace, burned out, beaten down, or simply swallowed by time. Records from town courts mention innkeepers charged with theft, bribery, and even murder. Some were saints, some were devils. Most were somewhere in between, just trying to stay alive while feeding the hungry, housing the damned, and making sure their children didn't starve. The laws they lived under shifted like sand. One year they owed a flat tax to the Lord. The next, a cut of every drink sold. And if they didn't pay, their shutters came down or their roof burned up. Protection rackets thrived. Bandits collected their dues, and corrupt bailiffs skimmed their share. Being too honest meant being too poor. Being too soft meant being dead. And yet, the inn stood, through fire, famine, frost, and plague, through rebellion and betrayal, laughter and blood. The inn was the one place where everyone met, the runaway monk and the bounty hunter, the orphan girl and the toothless bard, the knight fleeing disgrace and the pilgrim crawling toward salvation. It was no merry gathering from the tales of Robin of the Green or bard songs about kings in armor. It was dirt, disease, danger, and desperation. But it was also life, raw, wild, and defiantly stubborn. And if you've made it this far, you've survived the tale of the medieval inn, a place where every floorboard whispered secrets, every drink carried risk, and every breath could be your last. So the next time you check into a hotel and complain about the broken ice machine, remember Berla's ladle, Cyric's stare, and the inn that stood in a storm. Follow or subscribe the channel if you want more forgotten corners of history brought back from the smoke and ashes. Because this was no fairy tale. This was survival.